Okay, so welcome to topic 6, lecture 2. And in this, we're going to dig in a little bit more deeply in terms of thinking critically about Congress. So earlier in the semester, we discussed the Constitution in terms of the architecture of democracy. The Constitution was designed in a way to promote democratic decision making, but in a way that prevents tyranny of the majority. Okay? So in a democracy, you want to make sure that the people are doing the ruling and the desire and the will of the people is reflected in the decisions of that democratic government. However, the framers were also really concerned that if you have a one person, one vote structure of government, that whoever ends up in the majority is always going to get their way, right? And that then the majority can end up acting like a tyrant, and those who aren't in the majority, that their interests and concerns are left on the sidelines. And so the Senate is a really good example of an architecture of democracy, of trying to design a way to promote democratic decision making without the fears that come with tyranny of the majority. And so, as we know, that states with smaller populations have more power in states than the states with a larger population. And why is that? Because every state gets two voices. So if you're a really populous state, like the state of California, you get two senators, but a really lowly populated state like Vermont or Wyoming, they also get two senators, right? So it actually gives the states that have a lower population more of a say in Senate because the representation that all states get in the Senate are equal. So how has this less populous states have more power design played out over the course of the last 230 years since the Constitution's been ratified? Do less populous states have too much power in the Senate? Has the structure of power in the Senate shifted from placing a check on the power of the majority to enabling the tyranny of the minority, where the minority can basically stand in constant roadblock to the will of the majority? A little bit is good, but has it gone too far? Well, one way to think about whether or not this design is still working is to maybe think about what the conditions were at the ratification of the Constitution. What was the distribution of population among the states when the idea of having two votes for every state in the Senate, when that came to being at the Constitutional Convention? And so the ratio between the state that has the smallest population and the state that has the largest population, that's changed significantly since the ratification of the Constitution. So the first census in the United States took place in 1790, and it's taken place every 10 years since then. So after the Constitution was ratified, we needed to know how many people lived in the United States, in particular because the representation in the House of Representatives was going to be based on population, so we needed to know what the population of the states were. And so in 1790, the most populous state was Virginia, and the least populous state was Delaware. And Virginia was much bigger than Delaware at a ratio of 12-1. So in other words, the voters in Delaware, their voice was 12 times more powerful, so to speak, than those who lived in Virginia, because Virginia got two senators and Delaware got two senators, and so Delaware had a larger voice at a ratio of 12-1. That's changed significantly when we compare today's most populous state to today's least populous state. Today's most populous state, won't come as a surprise to you, is the state of California. The least populous state is Wyoming. And so California has a population of nearly 40 million, and Wyoming has a population of 576,000, about the size of Milwaukee, okay, in terms of the population. And as you can see there, that the ratio between the most populous and the least populous in 2021 is 69-1. And so basically, voters in Wyoming, right, their will has is, has a 70 times greater voice than those who live in California. And so, I mean, that maybe one could think, well, maybe the framers were comfortable with a smaller ratio, but when the ratio gets this large, maybe it becomes somewhat problematic. Here's another way of thinking about this problem. So if we look at population trends in the United States, okay, and that the big states keep getting bigger and some of the small states kind of are shrinking, okay, that when you look at census data and you predict to the future, that they're saying that by the year 2040, about a little bit less than 20 years into the future, that 70% of the population in the United States will live in 15 states. And 30% of the population will live in the remaining 35 states. Okay, and so when you look at it this way, right, that 70% of the population will get 30% of the representation in Senate, and on the flip side of that, right, that 30% of the population will get a voice of 70% in the Senate. Okay. If you compare that to 1790, that there was a gap, obviously, that when you look at where the number of states that 70% of the population lived in 1790, they lived in 7 states. Keep in mind there were only 13 states at this time, okay? So that they lived in 7 states and got 54% of the representation in the Senate, right? Because, 2 senators for every state. And then when you do the math, 7 divided by 13, it's 54% of the Senate. Okay. And so that's, a gap, right? But it's not the same kind of gap that we have today. Today, the gap that we have is a difference of 24 points, okay? And so that 70% of the population gets 30% of the representation in the Senate come 2040. And in 1790, 70% got 54%. So if you take the difference between 54 and 30, it's a 24-point difference. And so, one wonders if the difference was that great in 1790, whether or not the framers would be so supportive of every state getting 2 votes. So the framers clearly wanted to give magnified power to less populous states. But the question is do you think that they wanted this much magnification? Did they want this magnification of the power of the less populous states to be this large? And when you think about it, it's exacerbated by something that the framers didn't really even think about, which was parties. Okay, so there were no parties when the Constitution was made, and in fact, after George Washington served for 2 4-year terms, and when he left office, he in his farewell address, he's looking out at those who are attending his farewell address, and there you have, Alexander Hamilton with the Federalist Party and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison with the Democratic Republican Party. Those are the first 2 parties that developed in the United States, and they were bitter rivals. And George Washington admonished, said, we really have to be worrisome. That's worrisome that parties in these factions are starting to take over. And so at the time of the ratification, that there wasn't this thinking that things would be divided along partisan lines. But, we're at a time period, and we'll be talking about this later in the semester, where we have a great, level of partisan polarization. And that partisanship is, as it says there, it's exacerbated by partisan regionalization, okay? And so that when you look at the largest states in the United States, California, Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, right? Those are sort of mixed states, okay? They get a mixed bag in terms of California, more blue, Texas, more red, Florida, more red, Pennsylvania, mixed, right? So you don't have that one party dominance in the Senate. That's not the case, though, with the least populous states. That of the 5 least populous states, only Vermont sends Democratic senators to the Senate. The other 4 are, as it says there, one party dominated. And in this case, it's dominated by the Republican Party. Now, whether it's the Republican Party that's dominating the small states or the Democratic Party dominating the small case states, it shouldn't, matter. The concerns should be equal, right? I mean, it's sort of like when you have these lowly populated states and that they're all sort of voting the same way, that not only are they getting more say in the Senate, but one party's getting more say in the Senate. And that should be a concern whether or not that would be the Democratic Party getting more representation in the Senate or the Republican Party, right? It sort of exacerbates this tyranny of the minority. And so, you think if the framers had sort of known about the rise of parties, which obviously they thought about soon after the ratification, and then they also saw that how some of this partisanship would play itself out in regionalization in terms of the dominance in smaller states, then maybe that the framers might have had a different perspective on the divvying up of Senate seats, 2 Senate seats for each state. So, just thinking critically about the Senate, would the framers regard this as a problem? Not, necessarily the partisan regionalization, but this magnification of power in the less populous states. Would they view that as a problem? And if so, or do you view it as a problem, right? And so, if it was a problem, I mean, maybe what is a fix for the problem? Some say, ending the filibuster would be a fix to this because the voice of those who are not in the majority is already magnified in the Senate. The filibuster, which is a Senate rule, it's not in the Constitution, but it says you need 60 senators to get anything done in the Senate. That provides an additional magnification of those whose voices are not in the majority. And so maybe one way of tamping down this over magnification of the voices in the minority would be to end the filibuster. There was a proposal in California to divide California up into like 3 or 4 states, right? And so it'd be sort of like you have this giant state. Maybe the framers would think, whoa, this giant state, maybe that needs to be broken up, right? It was a referendum that was on the ballot. It never went anywhere. If we wanted to give the more populous states, more senators in order to sort of, level the balance between the more populous states and the less populous state to close that gap, you'd have to amend the Constitution. But there's nothing preventing the amending of that Constitution to give more populous states more senators. But just some things to think about as we're sort of thinking about democracy and representation in the Senate. All right, let's turn our sights now to thinking critically about the House of Representatives. So currently there are 435 congressional seats or congressional districts in the U.S. House. So there's 435 seats. And as we know that the House is based on population, so the more populous your state is, the more seats you get in the House of Representatives. And so every 10 years we have a census, okay? And then we see how population has changed within that state. And throughout the nation. And then, as it says there, every 10 years, congressional district lines are redrawn, okay? And so we just had a census in 2020, and so that each of the congressional districts need to contain about the same number of people, okay? It's going to be an approximation. They don't go around counting every day, right? But it's about, coming out of the 2020 census, each congressional district has about 760,000 people in them. And that's really big. And that's, that the number of people living in each congressional district has really grown because the number of House seats has stayed the same since 1920. 435 seats, that's not in the Constitution. The fact that they need to be apportioned is based on population is in the Constitution. But Congress has set the number at 435 seats. If we wanted to decrease the number of people in each district, we would have to add more seats to the House of Representatives, and I don't see that happening in the near future. So every 10 years, the congressional district lines are redrawn to reflect these changes within population patterns. And the entity that does the redrawing of these district lines is usually the state legislature, okay? And so like in the state of Wisconsin, when district lines, congressional district lines, need to be redrawn. The state legislature in Madison, they draw up new district lines, and that whichever party is in power, if it's the Democrats or if it's the Republicans, that they're likely to redraw those district lines in a way that sort of favors their party, okay, gives their party the upper hand. Because, you'll read in your textbook about how you can gerrymander and you can redraw district lines in order to favor one party over the other. And Democrats redraw district lines to favor Democrats. Republicans who are in control of the state legislature, they redraw the district lines in order to favor their party. Okay, and so those lines are redrawn every year. Now, if the lines are drawn in a way that overtly favors one party over another, that's seen as unconstitutional. Although recently the Supreme Court, partisan gerrymandering cases have come to the Supreme Court, and that while they've said that partisan gerrymandering has the potential of violating the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment, that the way that gerrymandering has been going on up to this point, that there's not enough evidence to say that it actually is in violation of the Constitution. But partisan gerrymandering is the drawing of political boundaries to give your party a numerical advantage over an opposing party. But it has to be done in an intentional way with the intention of giving your party more of a leg up. And up to this point in the Supreme Court, that's been very difficult to demonstrate. So it happens, it's just not regarded as unconstitutional. So since representation in the House is based on population, as population patterns shift, so do the number of representatives that each state gets, okay? And so this is a graph, and let me put on my magic pen here. This is a picture that shows you the results of the 2020 election. And so basically it says here, this is going to be the apportionment of the United States House of Representatives based on the population shifts that we've seen in the 2020 census. If your state is in white, you keep the same number of House seats that you've had, okay? So here's Wisconsin. Wisconsin has 8 congressional districts. In other words, 8 members of the House of Representatives. We did not gain a seat. We did not lose a seat. We used to have 9, but we lost a seat in the 2000 election, and it went down to 8, okay? But we've stayed the same. A lot of the states have stayed the same. If you are a state that's in purple, that means that relative to the other states, your population has declined. And so these states are losing a House seat. Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, okay? California lost a seat as well. And that's because we're seeing increases in population in Florida, North Carolina, Colorado, Texas, and then up in the Pacific Northwest. And so the light green states are getting 1 additional state, and Texas is getting 2 additional states. Okay, so this just shows you, gives you about a little bit more information about regional change. Okay, so as we see the Midwest losing representation in the House of Representatives, that might reduce the concerns of those in the Midwest, right? So deindustrialization, declining youthful population, other agricultural concerns, you might not get as much of a voice in Congress. But other states are increasing their voice, and that might have an impact. Some of the southern states might have an impact in terms of the kinds of legislation that gets presented and potentially gets more support because some states have more power and other states have less power. All right, so this shows you the congressional districts in Wisconsin. As I mentioned before, Wisconsin has 8 House seats, 8 congressional districts. And you'll see here that some of the congressional districts geographically are very large because in the north there are less people that live there, and so we know that there needs to be 700,000 people in each of the districts, while the more populous areas of Wisconsin in the southeast, the districts are geographically smaller because this is a more populous area. Another thing that I'd like to point out is that of the 8 congressional seats, 5 are held by Republicans and 3 are held by Democrats, although that's likely to change that Ron Kind is not seeking re-election, and it's likely that a Republican is going to win in the 3rd district. This is Ron Kind's district over here. For those of you who live in the Waukesha, Washington County area, that if you live in Milwaukee, that in Milwaukee County, it's likely that Gwen Moore is your representative. If you live in Waukesha or West Bend, it's likely that Scott Fitzgerald is your representative. If you live a little bit north of West Bend, it's possible that Glenn Grothman is your member of the House. And if you live down here in the Racine-Kenosha area, then it's possible that you live in the 1st Congressional District and Brian Steele could be your representative. So Wisconsin is considered a purple state, okay? I think most of you know what that means, but it's purple because Wisconsin is about equal parts Democrats, blue, Republicans, red. When you look at the most recent Marquette poll, when you ask people what party do they identify with, that 45% of people say they identify with the Republican Party or they lean towards the Republican Party. 4% say that they identify with the Democratic Party or lean to the Democratic Party. And 9% consider themselves to be independent. And so that includes leaners. When you take leaners out and just ask people, do you identify with the Republican, the Democratic Party, or do you consider yourself neither? You got a different picture of Wisconsin. When you take out the leaners, 30% of people in Wisconsin identify as Republican, 28% identify as Democrats, and 41% identify as independents. So the Wisconsin electorate is purple, as we just saw on the previous slide. So you might be wondering, why aren't the House seats more proportionally split? Since we have 8, why don't 4 go to the Democrats and 4 go to the Republicans? Currently, 5 go to the Republicans and 3 go to the Democrats. And after the midterms, it's very likely that 6 of the seats will go to the Republicans and 2 go to the Democratic Party. And so you might be asking yourself, well, why is that? Furthermore, as we also saw with the electorate, that 41% of people in Wisconsin consider themselves not to be affiliated with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, but consider themselves to be Republican. So why aren't there more multi-party representation among the seats within the 8 seats that we have for the Congress? Why don't some of them go to a party that's other than the Democrats or the Republicans? Why don't they go to the Libertarians, or why don't they go to the Green Party, right? Why don't we have a more plural representation of parties, given that 41% of Wisconsin voters consider themselves to be independent? Well, there's several explanations for why that is the case, but we're going to focus on one explanation. And that one explanation is the concept of single-member winner-take-all districts. So what is a single-member winner-take-all voting system? The kind of system that we have for congressional elections throughout the United States for the most part. Well, what that means is that each of the 8 congressional districts are represented by one person. And we saw that on the previous slide when we saw the breakdown of representatives in Wisconsin. So that the congressional district that you live in, I live in the 4th district in Milwaukee. And so come November 8th when I vote, that I will vote for the person that I want to represent the 4th district. If you live in Waukesha or West Bend, you're going to go and vote, and you're going to vote for the person you want to represent the 5th district. It's a single person that represents that district. Furthermore, the way the person wins that seat is by getting the most votes, okay? They don't need to win with a majority of the votes. A majority of the votes is 50% plus 1 of the votes cast. They just need to get the most votes, okay? And so, and that's what's known as a plurality of system of voting. You don't need 50% to win. You just need the most. And that's why it's called a single member. One member represents the district. Winner takes all. Whoever gets the most votes win voting system. So what is wrong with the single member winner take all voting system? Well, one thing that's wrong with it is it may not do the best job of reflecting voter preferences. In a single member winner take all voting system, that a voter may not vote for their candidate of choice because they know that the person that they want has to get the most votes to win. So, for example, a voter may want to vote for a third party candidate because that third party candidate might come closer to their values, but they or feel like, well, there's no way the third party candidate's going to come in and get the most votes. And so doing that is a wasted vote. And so instead I'm going to vote for my second choice. Okay. And so concrete example, let's say that you're a libertarian, right? And you might say, hey, there's a libertarian candidate on the ballot. That's the candidate that comes closest to my preferences. But in a winner take all single member district, I'm not going to waste my vote on the libertarian because they have no chance of winning. So instead I'll go for the Republican because the Republican comes closer to my values as a libertarian. Okay. And so the voters really wanted a libertarian, or the voters really wanted, a more progressive sort of Democratic Socialist Party candidate, right? But they end up voting for the Democrat, or they end up voting for the Republican. Well, ranked choice voting might do a better job of determining the preferences of the electorate. It might be a better way of electing members to these House districts in Wisconsin. Wisconsin doesn't use ranked choice voting yet, but some other states are using it as a way of getting a better sense of what the preference of the voters is. So what is ranked choice voting? So ranked choice voting can be used when you have a district, so the 4th district of Wisconsin, and that there are multiple candidates who are running to represent that district. Right now we have a system where there are primaries, and in the primaries, the top vote getter for the Democrats and the top vote getter for the Republicans, they're the ones who show up on the ballot. But in ranked choice balloting, that you just have a list of candidates that are on the ballot. And so as you can see here in the diagram, it's sort of like, okay, these are the 4 candidates that are running to represent the 4th congressional district of Wisconsin. And then as you are voting, you say, okay, well, this is my first choice, candidate A, my second choice, candidate B, third choice, candidate C, fourth choice, candidate D. So you rank your preference for the candidates based on who your first choice is and downward from there. And then when it comes to tallying up the votes, this is what happens. That you first count the voters' first choices, okay? And after you tally up all the votes in the 4th Congressional District of Wisconsin, you ask yourself, does any one of the candidates have a 50%? Did they win with 50%? And if the answer is yes, they are the winner, okay? However, if there is no one who gets 50% of the votes, that you eliminate the last place candidate, the candidate that came in last. Then you recount the ballots, and then you ask yourself, did anybody come up to get a majority? If yes, then the winner's announced. If no, you eliminate the one who came in last, you recount, and you keep doing that until you get a person who wins with more than 50% of the vote. That's how ranked choice voting works. So what are the benefits of ranked choice voting? Well, for one, ranked choice voting might do a better job of determining the preferences of the electorate. The way it is now, as we said, you're not likely to vote for the candidate that comes closest to your values because you might view it as a loss in throwing away your vote. But here, since you can, if your first choice doesn't it comes in last, then your second choice gets taken into consideration, and then your third choice. And so that more people might be willing to take a chance on a third party candidate because they might say, hey, maybe it will be the first choice of other votes. And if it isn't, my second choice will be counted. Ranked choice voting might also support more moderate candidates because the candidate needs 50% plus one to win. In a winner take all system, that whoever gets the most votes wins. And so that might encourage a candidate to just speak only to its base, right? If I can only mobilize enough of my base, that could be enough to win. However, you need to have 50% plus one to win in a ranked choice voting system. And so a candidate might say, hey, I can't be too conservative or too liberal because I won't get in first place. I won't get 50% plus one. And so on that first round, candidates might really saying, hey, I want to win 50% plus one on that first round. And that might make a candidate reach out to more moderate voters rather than just depending on their own party to come out and vote for them. It could encourage more candidates of the same party to run in a very blue or a very red district. Some states that are using ranked choice voting, they have two rounds. It's like the primary round and then it's the general election round. And so in the primary round, it's sort of like all candidates get to run. And then maybe they take the top five candidates, the top five vote getters of the candidates. And then in the general election, they'll take the top five, and then that whoever gets 50% plus one in that becomes the person who's going to represent that district. And so if you live in a really, really blue district, that our primary system is the Republicans vote for the Republican candidate and the Democrats vote for the Democratic candidate in the primary. If you live in a really blue district or really red district, whoever wins the primary is the one who wins that seat in the general election, right? Because, you live in a blue district, most people are going to vote for the Democratic candidate and vice versa. And so in this way, if you do ranked choice voting, you could have, 4 people that would be running, after the primary, and you could have 3 Democrats running, or you could have 3 Republicans running, or you could have, all Democrats running or all Republicans running in a red district. And that would give, Republicans a choice between the candidates that are running. And that also might, create a candidate that, has this broader reach out to the rest of the electorate. It could also partially counter the impact of gerrymandering. Since gerrymandering is, where the party in power draws the lines, right? And so it's like, we're going to draw these lines so that it favors our party. Well, if party can be sort of diminished and diluted in ranked choice voting, because you could have multiple candidates from the same party running, right? And so it could counteract the impact of gerrymandering. On the downsides, ranked choice voting can be seen as confusing to voters at first, but from reports from states that are using this is that voters get used to it pretty quickly. And, if in Wisconsin a district was to elect a libertarian or a democratic socialist or, a third party, they would go to Congress as a member of the third party. And that multiple party systems are far from perfect, and that it's sometimes hard to get things done because you have too many parties and it's sort of hard to come together and, coalesce around and create a majority out of a coalition of different parties. So in conclusion, you can ask yourself, would it be more democratic, small d, in order to adopt a ranked choice voting system for House seats? Would it come closer to what the electorate wants? And you can think, and we'll talk more about this, and we're going to be doing a whole discussion on this later in the semester. Would a multi-party system, be beneficial? And, even putting just ranked choice voting to the side, that right now the redistricting process is partisan. Whichever party is in control of the legislature redraws the district lines, which lead to drawing lines that favor the party in control. Should redistricting done by a nonpartisan committee, either it could be done by computers that are just coming up with the most logical sort of districts, or it could be done by a board that's equally Democrat and Republican, and so that there's less of a desire to draw district lines in a way that favors one party over another. Okay, that's it for this lecture. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.